Hi, everyone. Welcome to our lecture on Chapter 6. Let me just remind you for a second of where we've been and where we're going. So, in Chapter 4, in our first video, we talked about the basics of the supply and demand model. In that chapter, I basically just set up the model to let you know how we conceptualize and how we think of the model, where the model comes from. In the second video to Chapter 4, we worked through a few simple examples using the supply and demand model. Once we had the model in place, we just thought about a few kind of exogenous shocks that could affect markets, and we used the supply and demand model to think about how price and quantity, how those market outcomes would be affected in response to those shocks. That was all pretty straightforward. I think everybody can follow along with that pretty easily. In Chapter 5, Chapter 5 was kind of a technical chapter in some sense, because there all we were doing was talking about elasticity, filling you in on another concept that's going to be useful as we work with supply and demand as we go through the course. Now, in Chapter 6, we're going to actually put the supply and demand model to use in a much more interesting sense, I think. I think Chapter 6 is going to be a much more interesting chapter overall. Here, what we're going to do is we're going to take supply and demand, and we're going to look at a few government policies, and we're going to think about how we can use the model of supply and demand to think about how those government policies will affect outcomes. I think in Chapter 6, you'll start to get a much better taste of the usefulness of supply and demand and helping you think carefully about economic outcomes. And you'll get a better sense of just the wide applicability of how supply and demand can be used in so many cases to get a clear understanding of what's happening in the real world. I think it's a good chapter, and I've kind of talked myself into a situation where I'm a little bit excited about this lecture. I think this lecture will be much more interesting than the elasticity example, because we'll start to get a sense of policies and how those policies work. Let me move over to the screen sharing. I've already drawn up our basic supply and demand model here. First example we're going to go through is a price ceiling. When the government comes out and says, this is the highest price that you can charge for a particular good. It's illegal. We're writing a law. We're saying that it's illegal for somebody to charge a higher price than this. An example would be a rent control. Now, I can't come up with too many examples because this isn't all that common, but one of the really common examples, though, nonetheless, is rent controls. When the government says, okay, for these apartments over here, it is illegal to charge above this amount. So first off, the government could come in and say this. Let me just switch for the fun of it. The government could say, hey, look here. This is the maximum price that you can charge legally for this good. It's illegal to charge above this amount. X there, because charging above that amount is illegal. Well, this would be an example of a non-binding price control, because here's the equilibrium price, P star, right? We've already talked about how that works. There's P star, and people don't want to charge above this maximum price anyway, right? This is already the market equilibrium down here at P star. So the price ceiling is non-binding. It doesn't really matter, right? People only want to charge, say, $1,000 for these apartments, but the government mandated price ceiling is $1,500. Who cares? We're only charging $1,000. The more interesting example is down here. Here's their initial equilibrium price, P star. And now in this case, government comes out and says, okay, here's your maximum price. It's illegal to charge, that looks so sloppy. It's illegal to charge above this amount. Now this is an example of a binding price ceiling, because here the price ceiling actually makes a difference. The price ceiling actually is lower than what people are wanting to charge normally in the free market. So in this case, just think about it, right? This will just become the price, right? The market is not allowed to reach an equilibrium, right? Before we talked about how markets naturally reach equilibria, but that's only in free markets, when people are allowed to follow just natural economic forces on their own without any government intervention. In this case, the market's not going to be able to reach an equilibrium because of the maximum price, because of the government intervention. So this maximum price, since it's binding, will become the price. And at that price, here's the quantity demanded, here's the quantity supplied, and the quantity supplied is the actual quantity, right? Businesses aren't going to supply more than that, so the quantity supplied is just simply the actual quantity as well. Quantity demanded is more than quantity supplied. The difference is a shortage. The difference is a shortage. Normally, when some shock happens and if the market's thrown out of an equilibrium, then a surplus or a shortage occurs, price moves, and that movement in price brings the market back to a new equilibrium where quantity demanded is just equal to quantity supplied. But in this case, because the price ceiling, we don't have a free market, the price mechanism is not allowed to work to bring the market back to a new equilibrium. So we are just stuck with this kind of permanent shortage that will continue to exist as long as the maximum price stays in place. Does that make sense? Just an example that shows how government intervention, if it's binding, can create a permanent shortage, and that, that we're not going to go into the details of whether rent controls are good or bad. There's a lot of discussion that we could have there, but we're just showing that a permanent shortage can result from that intervention. Let's move on to the next example. What color should I use? Let's use blue. Here we'll use the example of a price floor, opposite example that we just talked about. And the real classic example of a price floor is with the minimum wage. This is a good example because it's very common. The federal government in the U.S. has a minimum wage, and most states also have their own separate minimum wage. It's a topic that people discuss for a long time, and it has some controversy associated with it. So it's a pretty exciting example to use. So here we're actually talking about a specific good. We're going to talk about the quantity of low-skilled labor. The quantity of low-skilled labor, right? Normally we think about the supply and demand model in terms of depicting the market for apples or the market for tennis shoes or the market for restaurant meals or whatever. Some of those examples we went through in chapter 4. But the supply and demand model is very broadly applicable. And you can even apply it to things like the labor market or the low-skilled labor market. So anyway, in this case, the government comes in and now we impose a minimum price. You can't legally charge below that price. I'm not even going to worry about a non-binding example. We're just going to start out just with the interesting case of a binding example where the minimum price is above what businesses would be paying for labor to begin with. And let me just further expand this. By the way, I kind of skipped over a simple example. Here's the demand for labor. The demand for labor, and this in the labor market, the demand for labor comes from businesses. Right? I mean, normally you think of businesses as being on the supply side in kind of a typical market, but here where we're talking about the market for labor, businesses are the ones that are buying labor, and here's the supply of labor from people or from workers or potential workers. Anyway, back to where we were. This is the price that businesses were paying for labor to begin with. Government comes in and says, this is the minimum price that you can legally charge. So in this case, here's the quantity supplied of labor. This is how many people are willing to work at that wage. Here's the quantity demanded of labor. And that, of course, becomes the actual quantity. right? That's all that businesses are going to hire at that wage. So, it doesn't matter if there's more people willing to work. I mean, the price mechanism isn't allowed to fluctuate to bring about an equilibrium, as we said before. So the quantity demanded is the quantity. And so this difference is, of course, an excess supply. Again, market can't reach an equilibrium, right? Normally an excess supply would lead to downward pressure on price, bringing the market to an equilibrium. That can't happen here because of the government intervention, because of that price floor that is in place. So here's the excess supply of labor. Here's how many people want to work at that wage that has been mandated. Here's the number of workers that firms want to hire at that wage that has been mandated. We have an excess supply. In the case of the labor market, you can also call this unemployment. It's just all the people who want to work but aren't able to find jobs in that area. So the minimum wage, assuming that it's binding, it creates permanent unemployment. That's a downside, that's a negative, that's a problem associated with the minimum wage. There are other concerns. Of course, people who want a minimum wage are worried about issues of fairness or what we might call equity. They're worried about low-income workers being able to survive and live a good life on a wage that's too low, so they want a minimum wage for that reason. And of course, the minimum wage does help all these workers that fall over here on the spectrum because those workers are now getting more income, of course. But the downside is here. It's the people who want to work at that wage, but who can't find a job because the wage is higher than businesses want to pay. So the minimum wage is pretty controversial because it has positives and negatives. Now here's an interesting point. I've just drawn this figure with slopes that I pulled out of air. I haven't talked about elasticity. So here's a question for you. It's not certain how elastic this demand curve is. How elastic is the demand curve in the real world? How would the effect of the minimum wage differ depending on whether the demand for labor were more elastic or more inelastic? I want you to go do some extra practice and draw the same minimum wage example with a really elastic demand curve. Then go and draw the example with a really inelastic demand curve. Do that. Pause the video, do that, and make sure that you are clear on that. Okay, now that you're back from pausing the video, I hope you found out that the increase in unemployment is a lot lower with an inelastic demand curve. It's a lot higher with an elastic demand curve. So what you see in the real world is a tendency for people who tend to believe that the demand for labor is more inelastic. They tend to favor a minimum wage more. People who find a demand curve that's more, or people who believe that the demand curve is more elastic, they tend to be more against a minimum wage. And that totally makes sense, right? If the demand for labor is really inelastic, then you're not going to get a whole lot of unemployment being created as a result of the minimum wage. And so the benefits of the policy in terms of transferring more income to low-income people, the benefits may be more likely to outweigh the cost, which the cost comes in the form of increased unemployment. If the reverse is true, the minimum wage would have more damage. So it's really hard to say, and I'm not going to get into all this detail. This is way beyond the scope of this class, because all we're doing here is really using this as an example to illustrate how the supply and demand model is used. But if this were a more advanced labor economics class or a more advanced public policy class, we could do more research and try to figure out really how elastic is that demand for labor, and that would really inform our opinion on whether the minimum wage is a good policy or a bad policy. But hopefully you can see the positives and negatives. hopefully you can see how this framework allows you to kind of illustrate those positives and negatives and think clearly and rigorously about those positives and negatives. And then hopefully you can see as well how in the real world we have to do empirical research to understand those slopes of the curves, especially the demand curve in this case, to understand the outcomes more fully. But at least we have a good analytical framework to think clearly in the first place about this. Let's go through another example. This example now will be that of an excise tax. An excise tax is just about the same thing as a sales tax. When you go to buy something, you have to pay a tax on that at purchase, then that's an excise tax or a sales tax. The difference is a sales tax is a general tax on a bunch of different stuff that you buy. An excise tax is a tax that's levied on a specific good. So you see excise taxes on things like gasoline or cigarettes, taxes that are levied on specific goods. A sales tax in general is more broad, levied on a whole bunch of stuff, but it's still the same concept. So here's where we are to begin with. Here's our regular supply, here's our regular demand. And we're going to introduce an excise tax into this market. And here we're going to assume the tax is paid by the seller. The law, the way the tax is written into law specifies the tax is paid by the seller. So how will that tax affect this picture? How could we incorporate that tax into this picture? You have to remember the supply curve is just the marginal cost curve. That's all it is. It's straightforward. That's where it's derived from. So this supply curve reflects all those costs that businesses face, various input costs. It's reflective of technology and those other factors as well. But if the seller has to pay a tax, to the government whenever it makes a sale, then that tax basically just becomes another part of their cost. Just becomes another part of their cost. Their marginal cost increases by the amount of the tax. So imagine for this unit, Q1, just imagine here for Q1, the marginal cost increases for sellers by the amount of the tax. And that's true for all these units along the spectrum. For every unit, from unit 1 to unit 1,000,000, the marginal cost increases by the amount of the tax. So this shift, this distance between the two curves, this distance here is just simply the amount of the tax. The supply curve rises vertically on the page by the amount of the tax. So this is the supply with the tax. The supply after the tax has been introduced becomes the new supply curve. So as you can see, supply moves leftward, and that's a decrease in supply. Remember, to be clear on that, that's a decrease in supply. Remember how we discussed that in the chapter 4 lecture. So we started out here at point A. Now we wind up at point B once the market reaches a new equilibrium, once supply has shifted. This becomes our new price, and this becomes our new quantity. So the market price rises, and the market equilibrium quantity falls as a result of the tax. Okay? But the interesting part here, though, is the market price is rising, as we have depicted. The amount of money that consumers are paying out is rising. But you have to remember that businesses are, even though they're getting P2, even though they're getting more money from the customer, they're turning over, that excise tax to the government. And the difference between these two supply curves is the amount of the tax. That's how we set the supply curves up in the first place. So if you think about it this way, go to this point, the distance between the two supply curves. This amount here amount sellers keep. That's the amount that sellers keep. That's read off the old supply curve, because all they're keeping is still just reflective of the old supply curve. The difference between the two is just the tax, which is just being turned over. They're not keeping that. So the market price is higher, the amount consumers are paying is higher, but the amount that sellers keep is lower. The difference is the tax revenue, and most fundamentally, the quantity of a good that's being produced has fallen as a result of the tax. Okay? Let's go through another example. I'm going pretty quickly, but of course, since you're just watching this on YouTube, you can pause at any time and digest and reflect. So we're going to go through another excise tax example, same example, except now we're going to assume the tax is paid by the buyer. Tax is paid by the buyer. Again, this is all just based on how this is written into law. The law could be written either way, and in different cases, the law is written, you can actually find laws in the real world where it's paid by buyers. You can find laws where it's paid by sellers. Here's the price initially, just like before. Here's the equilibrium quantity initially, just like before. So, start out here at point A. Remember, in this case now, you have to remember that the demand curve is the marginal value curve. It shows the additional value that a consumer receives from each additional unit of this good. That's what demand is derived from. That's what demand fundamentally represents. That's what we discussed and you learned in chapter 4. So demand reflects marginal value. That also reflects a consumer's maximum willingness to pay. It doesn't matter what the government policy is, a consumer is not going to pay more than their marginal value for a specific unit of a good. It wouldn't make any sense to do that. That's kind of how we conceptualize demand in the first place. So the demand curve is their marginal value curve. It also represents maximum willingness to pay. Demand represents marginal value. Demand also represents maximum willingness to pay. Same idea, and it makes sense. It's logical. So if this demand curve reflects the maximum amount that consumers are going to be willing to pay, then that's it, period. Nothing else to it. So if they have to pay that tax to the government, then the only way you can think about this, the only way that makes sense, is the maximum amount that consumers are willing to pay to the seller is here. There's the demand with the tax. The demand curve falls by the amount of the tax. This is any point along this demand curve reflects the maximum amount consumers are willing to pay in total. If they have to pay that tax to the government, this new demand curve reflects the maximum amount consumers are willing to pay to the seller. Demand falls, we get down here to point B, and we get a new equilibrium with a new price, a new market price, and a new quantity. So in this case, market price falls actually, and quantity falls. Market price falls, and the quantity falls. But that's still not the end of the story. This is the market price. This is the amount that sellers receive. This is the amount that buyers pay to the sellers. But you still have to add the tax on top of that if you want to think about the amount that consumers pay in total. The difference between these two demand curves vertically is the amount of the tax. This amount, go to this quantity right here and just go up to the old demand curve, their maximum willingness to pay, which incorporates, the new demand curve, which subtracts out the excise tax, but it goes back to add in the excise tax, going back to the original demand curve. This is the amount that buyers pay in total. This is the amount that buyers pay in total. So this is the interesting part. This quantity here occurs at the point, this is called the tax wedge. It occurs where the difference between the original demand and the original supply, this point right here, it occurs where the difference between the original demand and the original supply is equal to the tax. So the quantity, it falls in both cases, and the quantity will actually be the same. The outcome quantity will be the same in both cases, regardless of whether the excise tax is paid by the buyer, regardless of whether the tax is paid by the seller, the equilibrium quantity will be the same. And then the prices follow as well. The quote market price differs based on whether the tax is paid by the buyer or the seller. But when it all boils down, the amount that sellers keep and the amount that buyers pay in total is the same in either case. Whether the tax is paid by the buyer or the seller, that's called the statutory incidence. That refers to how the law is written, the statute. That's referred to as the statutory incidence. The statutory incidence. The true outcome, how much the quantity actually falls, and how much buyers pay in total, and how much sellers keep in total, that's called the economic incidence. And the economic incidence is what we really care about. The economic incidence is the real outcomes. And you can see in this example, or you can see in this series of examples, these two examples, you can see the statutory incidence does not affect oh my Lord, INCIDENCE. The statutory incidence does not affect the economic incidence. The true economic outcomes associated with this excise tax are the same, regardless of whether legally the buyer pays the tax or the seller pays the tax. Is that not interesting? I mean, am I that big of a nerd, or am I the only one who finds this interesting? You can use the supply and demand model. Even just right now, we just barely started this course, but you can also already use the supply and demand model to make up some, or not to make up, but to identify some pretty interesting implications associated with public policy. I think that's interesting, and I think that's part of why I'm drawn to economics, the way that it offers these tools to understand interesting things about economic outcomes and public policy. Let's go on to one more example. I'm sorry, I'm going to start that over. I was forgetting what I was doing. Pardon me. Let's go through another excise tax example. Tax paid by the seller. We'll go back to that original example that we laid out, an excise tax, but a tax paid by the seller. But here we're going to assume a very elastic demand, very elastic demand. So I'm just going to draw kind of a normal supply curve. I don't know why I say that's normal. It's like a 45-degree supply curve. There's nothing normal about that in the real world. It just kind of looks normal to us in some sense. But I'm going to draw a very elastic demand curve, a very flat, a very responsive demand curve. Just even a small change in price will lead to a large change in quantity demanded based on this very elastic demand curve. So here's our initial starting point. There's quantity 1, there's price 1. That's where we start out. So we're going to say the tax is paid by the seller. The supply curve will increase by the amount of the tax. Supply with the tax. This will become our new market price. This will become our new market quantity, Q2. And this will be the new price kept by seller. S-E-L-L-E-R. This graph is just the same as what we drew before. It's just I incorporated a pretty flat, a pretty elastic, a pretty responsive demand curve. So this is what I want you to do. I'm only going to draw this one. I want you to go on your own and draw this one as well. Draw an elastic demand curve, but also draw an inelastic demand curve. What you'll find is this drop in quantity, just draw the two graphs on your own. You'll see a big difference. The drop in quantity is large. The drop in quantity is large with an elastic demand, right? Because of the price increase that was generated as a result of this tax, that leads to a large outcome because demand is so responsive. Even that price increase, even if it's small, leads to a large outcome because demand is so responsive. Okay? You'll see, if you draw a relatively inelastic demand curve, you'll see a much smaller responsiveness. I want you to practice with these. I want you to see that on your own page with figures that you're drawing and creating yourself. And furthermore, this distance right here, the difference between the original price and the price that consumers pay, this is called the consumer's share of the tax burden, right? This tax, it's being paid to the government, has to come from somewhere. So it's either coming from the people buying the product or the people selling the product. So this amount is the consumer share of the burden. And this amount, the difference between the original price and the price that sellers keep now, this is called I'm going to move it down here. This is kind of really making a mess, but this is called the producer's share of the burden, the producer's share of the burden. In this case, when consumers are really responsive, right, when consumers are really going to abandon this product in response to a price increase that's been generated by a tax, when consumers will just walk away, in this case, we find the consumer share of the burden is relatively small versus the producer's share of the burden is relatively large. So producers are going to be harmed more as a result of this tax. Consumers are going to be harmed relatively less. The complete reverse would be true if we had a relatively inelastic demand. And you can work with these examples on the supply side as well, where the supply is elastic or inelastic. I'm not going to go through every example you can probably possibly think of, but you can work through all these possible combinations. But here with an elastic demand, you see a large responsiveness, a large drop in output, and you see the consumers are not harmed as much in terms of their share of the burden, in terms of how much of that tax they pay. Producers are harmed more significantly in this case in terms of their share of the tax burden. Just a few implications. You don't have to memorize this for the exam. These implications, I don't expect you to memorize them at all. Here, I can stop screen sharing. These implications, I don't expect you to memorize them at all. But what I want you to do is to understand this model, understand the nature of this model, understand how to work through this model, and understand how to apply this model to different questions, different policies, different scenarios. That's the whole point. Don't memorize it. Don't think that I'm going to have you just regurgitate this, but understand the model, practice the model, and be able to draw your own conclusions by using the model. That's the point of the class. That's what you need this toolkit for as you kind of go through your career or go through your life. You need to understand how to use it and apply it to situations that you see come along. And just by the way, here's a little bit of wisdom for you. I'm not a very wise person, but I'm going to give you a piece of wisdom nonetheless. This is a piece of wisdom that I have plagiarized from one of my old professors. Do y'all know what the best way to learn this is? What's the best way to learn anything? Is it like just rote memorization or something? The best way to learn this is to explain it to your roommate. Always the best way to learn something is to explain it to someone else. So if you're having trouble grasping and digesting supply and demand and understanding how to use it, then what you need to do is go and explain it to your roommate. Your roommate won't like you. Your roommate will think you're boring and annoying and a pain in the butt. That's bad, but you will know the material. So that's the cost. But if you don't know this, or if you're having trouble digesting this and learning and absorbing this, go explain it to your roommate, and I promise that will help so much. So that's the end of the chapter 6 lecture. It's a relatively short lecture. All we did is we took supply and demand and showcased how we can understand various government policies using supply and demand, and I hope it was pretty cool material. Talk to you soon.